Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. I am your host, Jennifer Frey. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Jen Frey, and I'm on Instagram at Professor Frey. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod. This episode is sponsored by the Classic Learning Test. The CLT is challenging the College Board, the so-called nonprofit that owns the APs, the PSAT, and the SAT exams, with alternative assessments. The reality is that standardized testing drives curriculum. What gets taught gets tested. The College Board focuses on bland informational texts, while the CLT puts students in front of the authors that we love here at Sacred and Profane Love. Dante, Flannery O'Connor, St. Augustine, you get the idea. Students can take the test at home via remote proctoring. You do not have to drive them to a testing site. And then they get their score back within a week, and they can then send those scores to more than 200 partner colleges that accept the CLT, and even colleges the CLT is not partnered with, but which will still consider the CLT as a supplemental part of the application. If you want to learn more, please go to cltexam.com. And you can also check out their podcast, Anchored, hosted by Jeremy Tate, which features conversations about classical education. In this episode, I speak with Thomas Pfau of Duke University about the Polish poet Czeslaw Milosz. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy, theology, and literature podcast hosted by me, Jennifer Frey. This afternoon, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Thomas Pfau of Duke University. He is the Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of English with secondary appointments in Germanic language and literatures and the Divinity School. He has published far too much for me to list, so I'll just say that he works on literary and philosophical subjects from the 18th through the 20th century. Welcome to the podcast, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So our topic this afternoon is the person and the poetry of Czeslaw Milosz. So let us begin with two obvious and important questions. First and foremost, who was Milosz and what has his influence been on poetry? And then secondly, why are you drawn to his poetry? And what do you think we can learn from him?
Yes. Just the question of who he was, I'm sure it would have bemused him because he was a person of many, many parts and always deeply suspicious of any attempt to sort of describe or fix his own sense of who he was. He had an extraordinary gift for introspection, but as well as an immense gift for vision. There is, for those who are just interested in his life, happily there has been, I think 6 years ago or so, a Harvard University Press published Andrei Franaszek's biography of Milosz, which is an absolutely terrific biography by any standard. Milosz, had a very eventful life. I would say it sort of breaks down in some ways into two halves. The first half, more or less, from 1911, when he was born in Lithuania, still a province in the Tsarist Russian Empire. It spans all the way until his defection from communist Poland, where he had served, for which he had served as an ambassador or as a member of the embassy in Paris in 1951. He defected, a very difficult decision. And after about 9 years of great uncertainty about where he was going to be and his wife and children and how they were going to make a life, he eventually was able to obtain a visa and join them in the United States and lived, on balance, of course, a much more peaceful, less tumultuous existence as a professor at UC Berkeley in the Slavics department. He returned after the fall of the Iron Curtain he returned to Poland and lived his last years in Krakow. So just to say that Milosz had lived from the late years of the Tsarist Empire to the first presidency of George W. Bush is to give you a sense of the scope of his experience. Absolutely.
Why did he defect?
There were Milosz was, even during the war, was keenly aware of the horrors of the Russian Gulag and of the profoundly repressive nature of Soviet-style communism. It was clear to him once it became evident that the war would be lost by Hitler that the long-term threat to freedom of thought and expression was going to issue from the Soviet-dominated governments of the satellite states in Poland and all the other countries behind the Iron Curtain. And he really couldn't see himself surviving intellectually and even spiritually in that world. And he, of course, wrote a book that made him quite famous, The Captive Mind, right. Which dwells on the many ways in which intellectuals and artists ended up deceiving themselves about the possibility of coming to some kind of livable arrangement with the Soviet-style government in Poland or nearby. And in the event, most of them came to a very tragic end. I mean, some committed suicide, others ended, in drink and, in alcoholic sort of, binges. It was really it was clear to him that that was not a livable proposition in the long term.
Right.
At the same time, exile in many ways is the dominant sort of trope that governs so much of his mature poetry after he defects. And exile, of course, for a poet is more than just having changed countries. It is losing touch to some extent with the evolving language in which you write. Mm-hmm. And to his very end, Milosz wrote only in Polish. Mm-hmm. Although he actively collaborated on translations of his poetry. More about that, I think, later. But it meant also exile from everything that had, in a way, informed his outlook on the world, the places and the feel of his rural Lithuania, where he had grown up, of Vilnius, where he had gone to high school and to do his studies, and, of course, of various cities in Poland, Warsaw, where he had spent much of the war years, often under harrowing circumstances. So all that reality was suddenly sort of remote. And he had to find his way into this utterly different world of the United States. Initially, for a brief while, he was an emissary still under the Polish government in New York and Washington. But then when he defected, then it was Berkeley, which in many ways was a surreal and distant compared to the world that he had experienced as a younger man.
Yeah, so I'm curious. So these years, these kind of post-war years before he defects, so like 1945 to 1951, he's writing poetry.
Oh, yes.
Is he primarily known as a poet? What's his reputation as a poet during that time?
At that point, his reputation is growing within the Polish literary community, certainly. But internationally, he is still quite unknown. That really doesn't change until the appearance, until the publication of The Captive Mind. Mm-hmm. And then, oddly enough, of course, he is known initially and somewhat improbably as a political writer, rather than as the poet as which he principally understood himself.
Right. So the position at Berkeley, is that based on his political writing or his poetry?
The position at the point that he was brought there, I think, was mainly driven by the poetry. Mm-hmm. Politically, in fact, you can imagine, and there are some interesting reflections on by Milosz in his autobiographical reminiscences. Politically, he found things at Berkeley to be strange and sometimes deeply alienating. This sort of infatuation of the 1968 student movement with some form of socialist or even communist form of governance. He had seen what that was like. He was not impressed. He thought that the free speech movement struck him as bizarre because he had really known what it was like not to have free speech. And the claim by those in Berkeley who argued that this was indeed something they were denied struck him as improbable because it just wasn't true. So Milosz, he tested sort of the ideological and political waters very cautiously, and is really a very not detached, but distant observer who feels this in this world a bit out of sorts much of the time. And that goes also to his experience of the landscape. California, I mean, there's this poem to Robinson Jeffers in which he reminisces about being in Death Valley. And this is a motif in Milosz that to some extent there are places in the natural world that seem palpably hostile to human existence. That's truly one. And so utterly different from the historically sort of slowly grown landscape of rural Lithuania, dotted with villages and churches and the sound of church bells and such. A very alien world in many ways to him.
Yeah, well, I think generally America is, one, just so big. I mean, even California is. It's huge.
It is. It certainly is.
It's enormous. And I think that is difficult for Europeans, And then also, really, a lot of America is wild in a way that it's not the case in Europe. I mean, there are some places like Norway where, there's a lot of wilderness, but certainly, you don't see that on the continent, at least. And so I would imagine there are all kinds of alienating features of America for Europeans, but especially at that time. I'm wondering if there's like a marked shift in his poetry from the kind of from the Polish years, to the American years.
Well, yes. I mean, the shift, I think, is more gradual overall. The poetry until 1945 is understandably, especially those harrowing poems about the war, is obviously very much defined by very particular moments of historical experience of upheaval, of danger, like Campo de Fiori or poems like that. So that obviously recedes over time. But Milosz was always someone who read very widely and so always tried to sort of gauge the deeper currents of history as they might unfold, even if they were not palpable and apparent to the people living in that history. So he is quite attentive to historical shifts in America in his poetry. I suppose the main shift actually comes somewhat later. In the 1970s, Milosz's poetry begins to veer more notably towards questions of religion and theology. He, of course, had a very strong Catholic sort of Thomist schooling in Lithuania, on which he then proceeds to reflect quite a bit. In the 1970s, he actually teaches himself Greek and Hebrew so as to translate books from the Bible into Polish. The Book of Job, for one, not a surprising choice. And his poetry really begins to sort of have a more and more Olympian perspective in which history is the kind of drama where the participants in that drama seem to never quite understand the parts they are acting. And so as he gets older, by then he is in his 60s and later 60s, the relationship between history and spirituality and Christianity, questions of eschatology begin to sort of become more pronounced. There's a kind of gradual detachment. I mean, a beautiful poem that might be worthwhile just briefly quoting is the poem called Late Ripeness, which is just before he turns 90. So it was one of the remarkable things about Milosz is that he continued to write poetry to the very end. In fact, while he was in Krakow and he was gradually losing his eyesight, he still had an assistant come to the house, and he dictated poems almost to the last few months of his life. In this poem, he writes, "Not soon, as late as the approach of my 90th year, I felt the door opening in me, and I entered the clarity of early morning. One after another, my former lives were departing, like ships, together with their sorrow. And the countries, cities, gardens, the bays of seas assigned to my brush came closer, ready now to be described better than they were before. I was not separated from people. Grief and pity joined us. We forget, I kept saying, that we are all children of the King. For where we come from, there is no division into yes and no, into is, was, and will be," and so forth. I mean, it's a very meditative poem that tries to sort of create some kind of momentary fusion between historical and eschatological time.
Yeah, I mean, my sense just from reading over the poems that you suggested to me is one gets a strong sense of a kind of very deep humility, right? On the one hand, and then a yearning for transcendence on the other. And he's a religious poet in the sense that he writes from a very biblical place. I mean, it's very clear that this is someone who knows the Bible.
Oh yeah,
and is alive to at least the powers of its symbols and its metaphors and its themes.
Yes. I think the one qualification that one may have to make here is that when we use the phrase of a religious poet in the way that it sounds in the United States today, I think we tend to often misconceive of it. I think American religious culture is actually, oddly enough, that's at least my impression, Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, is often informed by all kinds of things, but not by humility.
Right.
And Milosz actually, if he is a religious poet, then rather in the sense in which Eliot saw himself as being a religious poet, something about which he also felt very dubious. I mean, there's that 1935 essay by Eliot on religion and poetry, which he says, poetry that seeks to sort of convey a concrete religious message is really not what I try to do. I don't think it can even be done. Poetry has a religious dimension insofar as it wrestles with what it means to actually be a religious person. And for Milosz, that wrestling, that struggle, that uncertainty, and that doubt was always there. But the doubt would have been, could only be there because he understood that this was something one had to wrestle with. It was not something that could be avoided. And so there is in Milosz, there's a poem, for instance, to Father Chomsky many years later. Father Chomsky was someone who had been his religious instructor in middle school during his middle school years. And Milosz, about whom Father Chomsky said, you have the face of a criminal, he said to the student. Milosz certainly was a very argumentative student by all accounts. And so he challenged the father in all kinds of ways. And that, I think, in many ways defines Milo's persona. He was not opposing Christianity, but he was really trying to understand it and what it had to mean, what claim it had to him. He understood that it had a claim, but he also struggled with making it intelligible to himself. And of course, that struggle is deeply informed by the presence, the omnipresence of evil and of suffering, which he had seen in his formative years all around him. Not least of which is that he was from the beginning deeply alienated from the alliance between Polish nationalism and Polish Catholicism. Milosz was always wary of a Christianity that allied itself with a nationalist set of interests.
Right.
And during those years, of course, after the end of World War I, you have Poland and Lithuania as states in their own right. Obviously, there's considerable impetus for a sort of nationalist movement, and it grows stronger and more troubling because the increasingly anti-Semitic tones begin to enter in the 1930s. And so for Milosz, one of the challenges is how do you commit yourself to a religious, meaningful, profound spiritual vision without it being hijacked or co-opted or in some sense distorted by such political maneuvers and interests.
Yeah, and I think that's a special challenge for the
Yes.
Polish. Yeah. Maybe just to clarify slightly, so when I said he strikes me as a religious poet, I really meant something very general, and that is to me, the kind of one of the fundamental religious impulses is to affirm the world.
Yes.
To affirm the world in spite of, the evil and the scars and the suffering. And I just, at least in what I read to prepare for this podcast, I just see him as a man who takes very seriously the task of affirming the world, of trying to understand it, but always admitting, that he doesn't, right? He's constantly saying, I don't know, right? I won't pretend to know. And really just struck by being.
Yes.
Right. I mean, just really struck by the wonder of existence. And I think that's deeply religious, actually.
I completely agree with that. And I think with what you have just said, you have actually sort of pinpointed the two prongs that define his poetry, which is a kind of endless being mesmerized by the sheer richness, abundance, and beauty of the world and its particularity. And at the same time, a kind of fright at the evident fact that we don't seem to be, as human beings, capable of achieving lasting and meaningful orientation in this world. So that's where the figure of Pascal later comes in. You had asked about his influence. I think a couple of people, three in particular, are worth mentioning in this context. So Adam Zagajewski, who you know, who I think in many ways his poetry is sort of perhaps the most obvious successor to the poetic project of Milosz. Certainly in Polish literature, says that when he read Milosz first at the library at the Jagiellonian University Library in Krakow, he said the richness of the work, he says, was overwhelming. This constant energetic quest for the invisible in his poetry, a quest that arose amidst the most concrete sensual images. As he says later, he tried to drink in the cosmos. Beautiful formulation. The next one that I think is sort of quite insightful is, again, on the relationship between poetry and religion or theology also, is Robert Pinsky, the poet laureate, who also translated some of Milosz's writings. He speaks of Milosz's conception of irony And he says that truth, in Milosz's oeuvre, I think we see this, I mean, truth manifests itself as kind of a structural irony. And Pinsky, I think, very helpfully points out the following. He says that, it's not what he calls American irony, by which Pinsky means of, quote, Buster Keaton on a railroad handcar solemnly gesturing aside the locomotive that's heading toward him. So that's kind of a kind of situational and very circumscribed sense of irony. Instead, he says, with Milosz, what we have is directed toward an appreciation of our limited circumstance, not so much toward an appreciation of our limited circumstances, but toward the larger limitation of last things. He calls it an eschatological irony. And I think that's in very subtle and simple ways that comes through. I mean, take a poem like the early poem called Faith. This is in the New and Collected Poems. It's on page 48, although I think you are using a different edition.
Is this like part of the larger poem, The World?
Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I think this is worth reading. It's a very short poem. Faith, he says, faith is in you whenever you look at a dewdrop or a floating leaf and know that they are because they have to be. Even if you close your eyes and dream up things, the world will remain as it always has been, and the leaf will be carried by the waters of the river. You have faith also when you hurt your foot against a sharp rock, and you know that rocks are here to hurt your feet. See the long shadow that is cast by the tree, we and the flowers through shadows on the earth? What has no shadow has no strength to live. Now, this peculiar line that, rocks are there to hurt our feet. Mm-hmm. In the sense that things are not there because they are convenient. They're also not there because we might wish to imagine them. We don't, as he says, dream up things. This goes to Milosz's motif that he shares with Pascal, which is a deep distrust of the romantic concept of the imagination. Milosz is a poet who wants to see what is there, not to imagine another world that might be somehow beyond. That world will reveal itself only if we attend to what is actually here.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's, so I think it would be safe to call him a realist in that sense,
yes.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Trying to, he often talks about the importance of naming things, right? Where, to name something properly, mm-hmm. right, is to make the appropriate contact with the reality, right? To say something about its being or its essence. And I think that's, again, I don't know, as someone who has very sort of Thomist proclivities, mm-hmm. I'm deeply attracted to this vision. I wonder if how much of that, training, his education ends up in his poetry, because he does mm-hmm. take being seriously, right? And he does seem to see a connection between being and truth and beauty and goodness, right? Yes. It's the transcendentals.
Yes, I think you're right. His realism is deeply informed by his sort of training which unfolded within a very robust sort of Thomist or neo-Thomist framework. I think it's in a way, one could also say, however, that it was through poetry that he made that framework meaningful to himself.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. That's perhaps always how it should be, right? Nietzsche once nicely observed that, you repay your teachers very poorly if you remain a student forever. At a certain point, you need to then also take what they gave you and cast it in a mold that actually reflects your particular aptitudes and gifts. And one of the gifts Milosz undoubtedly had was of being tremendously visual. He had profound ability to see and to pick up the pregnant detail there's a wonderful moment early on in his great poem, a treatise on poetry from 1955, and in that poem, he sort of it's very in the preface to that poem, he's quite. No, actually, in the opening section, beautiful times, Krakow, 1900, 1914. Just to look at those opening lines, cabbies were dozing by St. Mary's Tower. Krakow was tiny as a painted egg, just taken from a pot of dye on Easter. In their black capes, poets strolled the streets. Nobody remembers their names today. And yet their hands were real once, and their cufflinks gleamed above a table. Now that little detail, right? I mean, those cufflinks, they're both pregnant because it sort of suggests a kind of late 19th century bourgeois sensibility, that the irony between the sort of the flawless attire and the fact that now nobody remembers their name.
Right.
No, that's how Milosz captures the real by looking. This is something he shares, I think, very much with the sort of poetics that emerges vicariously in the writings of Simone Weil, with whom he was very much. Simone Weil's conception of visual of attention, attention to the real. And also with Iris Murdoch, who I don't know that he read her very much or that he even knew of her, but Iris Murdoch speaks of poetry as fundamentally being the habit of accurate vision.
Yes.
And that's, I think, something Milosz very much would embrace.
Yeah, well, I love that. I mean, Iris Murdoch is all over this podcast.
Okay.
Any listener knows I love Iris Murdoch in a very deep way, and I'm very informed by her vision of the literary arts, and I see a lot of that in Milosz. And I have a question though. So he has a couple of poems that have treatise in the title.
Yes.
And, it's unclear in what sense these are treatises at all. So one wonders, is he being tongue in cheek? Is he being ironic?
Yes, I think so.
Is he saying something about what he's trying to do in these so-called treatises? And it also, so, I mean, I had that particular question, but it also kind of connects with a more general question, which is how he understood generally the task of the poet, the charge of the poet. What is poetry for?
Right. I think it's safe to say that Milosz had in his early school years and years at the university encountered enough treatises to know that what he was writing was not a treatise.
Right.
So there is definitely irony at work here, especially because the treatises almost invariably open with something very particular. They are not claims. They don't make sort of deductive arguments based on first principles, etc. The first principle, if there is one, is simply to look and see what's there, and then describe it to the point that what you describe becomes almost inadvertently revelatory. That there is a kind of epiphanic dimension begins to push to the fore, almost in spite of, it's not imposed on something, but it sort of arises from things themselves. What is his conception of poetry? Well, certainly, I mean, that's in some ways goes also to, my sort of what is my interest in this poetry is, as it happens, paradoxically perhaps, my training was in European Romanticism. And I've over the years drifted away from that field, although I still teach it occasionally. But I actually think the poets I now find most compelling are in some way or another, almost sometimes programmatically, but typically sort of implicitly at least, anti-romantic. Milosz is. T.S. Eliot is. someone like Zagajewski, I think, is also. Rilke is. In his book on Rilke, the German theologian Romano Guardini wrote that Rilke essentially had this understanding there were two ways in which you could approach poetry. One was as, and the German word here is Aussage, and the other one is Ausdruck. So either as a statement or as self-expression. And Rilke, certainly starting with his new poems and then in the Duino elegies, increasingly moves toward poetry as a kind of impersonal statement. And this impersonal aspect, I think, is also quite prominent in Milosz. Even though he's more comfortable than, let's say, the Rilke of the new poems, with using the first-person perspective. But it is not, what he sees will be true to the extent that it is not contingent on him seeing it. So that's why he says in that poem, Faith, right? That's why he has that wonderful, sort of charmingly simple line that says that, those floating leaves of which he speaks, even if you close your eyes and dream up things, the world will remain as it has always been. So the world's constitution cannot be a function of our imagining. So that's, I think what fascinates me is that Milosz thinks about poetry ultimately as the quintessential form of veridical and normative speech. It is like Eliot and Simone Weil, I think, writers who had clearly a strong impact on him. He met actually Eliot in London at some point. He realized that poetry is really of no use at all if it doesn't struggle towards objective truth. That's what it must struggle towards. It doesn't mean that it has a purchase on it. That would be a naive and irresponsible claim to make. But that must be its telos. And so anything else, he feels, and he's seen plenty of anything else. I mean, bad poetry, bad or profoundly untrue political writing, anything else ends up being an abuse of truth and of language. So that's something that I think emerges very clearly at the beginning also of the treatise on poetry, where he says, the opening here, in the preface, first, plain speech in the mother tongue. Hearing it, you should be able to see, as if in a flash of summer lightning, apple trees, a river, the bend of a road. And it should contain more than images. Sing-song lured it into being, melody a daydream. Defenseless, it was bypassed by the dry, sharp world. You often ask yourself why you feel shame whenever you look through a book of poems, as if the author, for reasons unclear to you, addressed the worst side of your nature, pushing thought aside, cheating thought. Poetry seasoned with satire, clowning, jokes, still knows how to please. Then its excellence is much admired, but serious combat, where life is at stake, is fought in prose. It was not always so, and our regret has remained unconfessed. Novels and essays serve, but will not last. One clear stanza can take more weight than a whole wagon of elaborate prose. So there is a sense of reclaiming poetry from this sort of niche pursuit that it has become in the modern era. There is a kind of Vatic voice, a kind of sense of the poet as someone who speaks the things themselves, as Rilke had also put it. That poetry should not be an esoteric pursuit. He writes a wonderful essay called Against Incomprehensible Poetry, which makes this point quite well. So this is essentially an attempt there, and this is what fascinates me about Milosz, and I think it's at the very heart of what he is trying to do, is to reclaim language from the many forms of abuse that it suffers. And he had seen that, of course, and memorably had analyzed it in, the captive mind when he, uses this Persian trope of Ketman, a language of total insincerity, and then traces it in so many of his contemporaries, who, making arrangements with the political powers that be, end up betraying their language and ultimately thereby themselves.
Right. Yeah, language.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And that's how Walker Percy, the American novelist, also described his task, was to take, he thought in particular religious language had become so cheapened and shopworn and so debased that really all he could do is try to reclaim it for us.
That's right, yeah.
And I was always really, really struck by that, but because it just seems true. Right. I mean, you can, it's like you can literally see it happening on Twitter. There's like a useful concept, and then a year later, it's just garbage. You can't do anything with this word anymore.
Yeah. There's something inflationary about the effect of social media, of course, on language. And
Well, because it accelerates,
a
process that's already there, and it just puts it into a kind of hyperdrive. But So the purpose of poetry is to be truth revealing. It's, some kind of cognitive enterprise. So if poetry can reveal truth to us, right, then it's not going to reveal truth to us in the same way that philosophy reveals truth to us, or that theology reveals truth to us, or that so what is the particular way that the poet manifests the truth?
Yeah. Right. So, take as a counterexample philosophy, or let's say a particular kind of sort of more analytic philosophy.
Sure.
Which
I'm an analytic philosopher, by the way.
I know, and I'll be gentle.
Let's not trash it too much.
No. But there are fundamentally there is a kind of premise in certain schools of philosophy that truth is something that can be claimed in the form of correct propositions.
Yes.
Milosz's argument, I think, is not against that. He would just say the truth that what for him the word truth signifies is something that we don't claim, we experience it. And we experience it because it is actually overwhelming.
Right.
It is not something that we can own, that we don't carry it like we carry our wallets. It's not portable property, as Dickens would call it. It is something entirely else. Yeah. And part of that truth is, for Milosz, is that we are always experiencing it in the form of a certain dissonance. The truth of what is in dissonance vis-a-vis the truth that should be. Truth for Milosz is overwhelmingly indexed with a sense of pervasive disorder, of cosmic disorder, of suffering, of evil. And therefore, the experiential dimension, rather than its propositional aspect, is what matters.
Right. Right. Well, I can totally agree that the analytic conception of truth is very limiting, right? I mean, it's just a property of propositions. And I think that if you compare that notion of truth to, say, this notion of truth you find in St. Thomas Aquinas, or frankly, even in Aristotle, I'm more attracted to the classical position, right? Where truth is about being, and it's about conforming oneself to reality.
One of the texts that I had mentioned to you is this little prose poem, Essay, Being.
Oh, I loved that. That was probably my favorite one.
Yes, this my edition, I think it's on page 243 or somewhere thereabouts. Yes, 249. And just a couple of lines from it, and then from one other poem, I think throw into relief the sense that the moment of truth for Milosz is also a moment in which a certain kind of, as he admits actually, a kind of almost Manichaean dimension reveals itself to us about existence. But here it's a very beautiful, it's a very uplifting poem in many ways. He's on the subway and sees this presumably very beautiful young woman. Then he says, a slightly snub nose, a high brow with a sleekly brushed back hair, the line of the chin, and then this little dash and the sidebar. But why isn't the power of sight absolute? And in a whiteness tinged with pink, 2 sculpted holes containing dark, lustrous lava, to absorb that face, but to have it simultaneously against the background of all spring boughs, walls, waves, in its weeping, its laughter, moving it back 15 years or ahead 30. To have. It is not even a desire. That's an important line, right? Seeing is here not a form of voyeuristic. It's not a form of voyeurism. It is a form of marveling that this is there. She got out as Raspai. I was left behind with the immensity of existing things. A sponge suffering because it cannot saturate itself. A river suffering because reflections of clouds and trees are not clouds and trees. So they said that's sort of for Milosz a moment of truth. There is a moment, there's always a moment of dissonance, maybe a strong term. There's always an element of something ultimately unreachable. There's too much of it, of that which we see. And when we really look at it carefully, we understand that we will never be entirely capable of participating it with the fullness that we sense.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to what I see as the religious impulse, this wonder at being, and connected to that wonder is the sense of its inexhaustibility, right?
Yeah.
And once you realize that being is inexhaustible, that's
the Platonic motif ultimately of philosophy beginning in wonder.
That's right.
Is really there, and it is
right.
In that sense, it's a deeply classical, a deeply Platonist sense that influenced Milosz.
Yeah. What do you think Milosz would say the poet has to teach the philosopher, right? If anything, or what the poet has to teach the theologian, if anything?
It's hard to say because I think Milosz would probably, it's hard to ventriloquize him here. I don't want to do that. But my suspicion would be that Milosz thinks you can only profit from this kind of poetry. First of all, it's the only poetry he can write. So it's not like he has options. This is what he writes at the moment that he does write it is also what he must write. He's not conducting frivolous experiments in verse, but he's simply trying to give a kind of witness-like account of what he has seen. And so it's poetry in the sense of testimony rather than self-expression, simply doesn't give much leeway. If you want to be faithful to being, that's what it's going to be. That means, however, that for any reader, philosopher or otherwise, whether the poetry in the end, whether it can give them something, whether it will speak to them, is very much contingent on whether they are searchers or whether they are more invested in control. And I think that's sort of fundamentally the distinction between classical and modern philosophy. Modern philosophy is essentially in its methodological habitus. Husserl in his late years figured this out very nicely in The Crisis of European Sciences. Modern philosophy in its habits is essentially risk averse. It wishes to, that's why its emphasis on method is so pronounced. Classical philosophy is a response to a sense of abundance, to visual and other kinds of epiphanies. And its telos, if there is one, is arguably a form of wisdom rather than of control.
Right. Yeah,
And
I think that's really I think that really hits at something deeply important just in general, but like something that I kind of vaguely see in not only in the poetry, but also I read The Witness of Poetry just to try to prepare. And one of the things that is sort of like a theme in Milosz is his daimon, or the need to rely on a daimon. And I think, and he even writes about why it's important to why it's important to read the New Testament in Greek, because you want to get a sense of the importance of the demons. And then he says something like, well, all that we can hope for is that we're possessed by good demons rather than bad ones. And he speaks of himself as a poet, as someone who is possessed, right? And this is super Platonic. I mean, this is all over Plato, especially the Phaedrus, where this idea of and I think that it is such a different perspective because, I mean, we just think it's all about autonomy and control, and we have very little space anymore for just receptivity.
Right, and the more one is invested in what Augustine would call sort of the libido dominandi, the more one is invested in that, the more, I mean, Plato in the Phaedrus shows that very clearly when he discusses a form of eros that is purely possessive. Ultimately, a form of, I mean, that's in the first speech in which sort of Socrates exposes the absurdity of a sense of eros as possession. Because what then happens is that total control ultimately can only mean the annihilation of that which we would possess. And the paradox is that with a quest for autonomy and control, we ultimately also find ourselves reaching a point of diminishing returns where the world becomes ever more remote and strange and illegible because we don't allow it to work its magic on us. But we have set up so many walls defending ourselves against contingency, risk, uncertainty. And so then in a way, the modern ethos of responding to the world by seeking to dominate and control it becomes really a form of sort of intellectual panic.
Right.
And Milosz, I mean, I think he is in that sense profoundly philosophical realist in the Platonic and Aristotelian sense, and obviously with the Thomist legacy also very prominent given his training.
Yeah. So where did he end up spiritually at the end of his life? I mean, did he return back to the church, or?
He did. There is, I forget in which poem it is, but he says, he was quite attached to going to Mass, attending Mass, as long as he didn't listen to the sermons of the priest.
That's not a bad strategy.
I found it to be actually quite useful on many, many occasions. Yeah.
I didn't say that, but
yes, but no, it is. I think it is the sense of what the liturgy gave him, I think, and I think Romano Guardini, for instance, and Joseph Ratzinger in their respective works on the spirit of the liturgy also pointed this out, is that the liturgy is one of the few ways in which we can still experience time as having a rhythmic structure to it, rather than being simply invariant chronometric time. because the time of scheduling is essentially arrhythmical. They are, it's purely adventitious. So if we want to experience time as having a certain kind of inner structure and organization to it, then the liturgy is one of the few places where we actually both mentally and also in a physical way almost understand it, because at a certain point you actually know when you should be kneeling, etc. It sort of becomes part of a habitus. Mm-hmm. And that has a deeply, it gives one a certain sense of orientation. Mm-hmm. I think Milosz in his later years found that quite crucial. He received last extreme unction and last sacraments before he passed. That was very important to him. But he was always deeply vexed by his own, I wouldn't want to say doubts, but by his sense that he was a terribly inadequate believer, which I think is a very good way to be.
He was very humble.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's because there's nothing more perilous, I think, to Christianity than this self-image that is too often conveyed in the public, that those who profess themselves to be Christian claim to have somehow answers and certainties that are and that they have in a way thereby transcended their human frailty.
Yeah, well, spiritual pride is spiritual pride is pride. You know?
Exactly. And so, I mean, the later Augustine, I think, becomes more of a presence, as of course does also Pascal. And then, also he read quite a bit of Jacques Maritain in his.
Oh, did he?
Over the years, yes, mm-hmm. About Pascal, I mean, just to give you a few interesting quotes, he writes he writes a letter to Thomas Merton, with whom he actually exchanged letters for a decade until the sudden death of Thomas Merton. But he says, what Pascal taught me was, quote, that nothing is more important than to find a common language with those who search in despair through poetry, prose, any means, being one of them, the blind leading the lame. Yes, what is needed is a new attempt of a Pascal. Or then think of, in another conversation that Cynthia Haven records, he says, for a man in crisis, as I am, Pascal is a spiritual brother. And that comes through in some of his poetry, like in the treatise on theology. To be human is to be completely alien amid the galaxies. Right. That's almost verbatim, really, of the immensity of those spaces frightens me in the Pensées. Right. When he speaks of, quote, the childish earth of illusion, or he says, we walk the earth without much comprehension. In this world, we walk on the roof of hell, gazing at flowers. Right. That's sort of, I think, there the humility, the sort of neo-Augustinian 17th century Port Royal spirituality that I think really speaks to Milosz comes through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really strong theme of exile, at least from the poems that you sent me to read.
Yes.
I can't remember which poem it was, but there was one poem where, he begins by just asking his reader, like, can you really feel at home in this world? Right?
This is actually the poem that I was just now thinking of, called An Appeal. An
Appeal, right. Yeah, that one.
Let me read out the opening long sentence, which is so marvelous. Because, again, what you have here is this incredible sense of the directness of address. I mean, it's called an appeal, but it's also formally crafted like, this is someone sitting right across from you in a kind of, in a setting in which, frankly, there's no escape. The question is going to be put to you and you're going to be stuck with it. Mm-hmm. So he says, you, my friends, wherever you are, whether you are grieving just now or full of joy, to you, I lift this cup of pungent wine, as they often do in the land of France. From a landscape of cranes and canals, of tangled railway tracks and winter fog, in the smoke of black tobacco, I make my way toward you and I ask you a question. Tell me, for once at least laying caution aside, and fear, and guarded speech, tell me, as you would in the middle of the night when we face only night, the ticking of a watch, the whistle of an express train, tell me whether you really think that this world is your home, that your internal planet that revolves, red hot, propelled by the current of your warm blood, is really in harmony with what surrounds you. What a remarkable way of writing, right? I mean, it's poetry, and yet it is also it is so remarkably free of any kind of verbal conceit. Although beautifully interposed are these sort of almost cinematic details, right? These little visual details, France, the landscape of cranes and canals, tangled railway tracks. He can often with immense efficiency conjure up complex visual memories in us. He doesn't describe, but these are almost like sort of little ciphers that trigger for us a visual association we've already had. So that when we read the poetry, it's more like a case of Platonic remembering of what we have seen, rather than being at the mercy of him describing to us something we have never seen.
Right.
And that creates a sense of community, because at that moment, the reader, the addressee of this poem, is actually able to feel, yes, I have seen that somewhere. I may not know where, but this is the same world. And that's, after all, the question. Is this world that we all have in a way in common, is it really our home?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's very Augustinian, I think.
Yes.
Have a strong sense of your own exile. So I guess now I just want to turn to a really practical question, and that's about translations and editions.
Yes.
So it is true that you and I are working from slightly different collections and translations.
Yeah.
So I just have, what do I have here? The Collected Poems, 1931 to 1987, HarperCollins.
Oh, yeah, that's an older edition. Yeah.
Yeah, so 1988. So is that not as good? Is there a better one that you recommend for our listeners?
No, the poetry is the same. I don't know whether you can see it. You probably can't, but it's what superseded it and is now actually the main edition in print is called New and Collected Poems, 1931-2001.
Okay.
That does not yet include the last poems, which appear in the last collection published by Milosz during his lifetime, called Second Space.
Second Space?
Yes, that's a slim little volume that appeared in 2001 when he was 90. And then there is also a more recent edition of some poems that were posthumously published. So Milosz and translation that's a really interesting topic. For one thing, I would say that this is a unique case. I generally don't think poetry translates well at all. Milosz is in some ways a miraculous exception.
Well, that's good, because most of us don't know Polish.
That's right. And I've talked with quite a number of people. In fact, I was in touch with Robert Hass recently because I kept wondering why his treatise on morality had never been translated, which is clearly a major poem. And Robert Hass, I think, more than anyone, has really earned, is deserving of immense praise for the work that he did all those years, translating together with Czeslaw the poetry. But it was really Hass who was the driving force here. And the poetry just reads, I find, spellbindingly well. No doubt there are formal aspects, metrical aspects, sonoric aspects, that sound patterning, etc., that we lose, and that's I'm sure it's in some cases quite regrettable. Mm-hmm. But I can not think of another poet who translates so powerfully. And this is something that actually Seamus Heaney, who writes a beautiful tribute to Milosz in a volume that Cynthia Haven published with poets on Milosz, in which Seamus Heaney remarks on Milosz and on the almost extraordinary translatability of the poetry. Let's see. I mean, so first of all, I think one of the reasons why it translates well is that Milosz cultivates a very direct and in many ways a very simple and plain style. Mm-hmm. So that helps. He avoids, as Adam Zagajewski puts it, he avoids all lofty hermeticism and language games. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that the language is not in all kinds of ways intricately playful at times, but it's not. There's never something. There is no esoteric sort of objective there. It also helps that Milosz himself, who had clearly a very considerable gift for languages, spoke Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, French, English. That he worked together with the translators, and that he also wrestled with translation. I mean, he taught, as I mentioned, he taught himself Greek and Hebrew to translate Old and New Testament books.
Yeah, which is incredible.
Yeah, and by then he was in his late 60s.
Yeah, the idea of me learning a new
really
language. Because your brain is ossified.
I can attest to that. Yes, it is very difficult. Difficult.
Very remarkable.
Yeah, he and then I would say that it's fascinating. You get to see in his exchange of letters, which is the only exchange of his no doubt very far-flung correspondence that has been translated, is "Striving Towards Being" is the title of this little collection of letters he exchanged over a decade with Thomas Merton. And when you read the first letters, you realize, Milosz, this is 1958, he's still quite a bit struggling quite a bit with English idiom. 10 years later, by the time the correspondence ends, that's all gone. Mm-hmm. So you can really see almost in the little graph over time how quickly he found his way into the language. Mm-hmm. But he had wrestled with translation too, which made him a very good judge for, and a person to collaborate with Robert Hass and Robert Pinsky on translating the poetry. Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time.
Yes.
But I am very grateful for this delightful conversation. Yeah, just thank you for helping me appreciate Milosz more. I'm really grateful.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy and theology podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and produced by Catholics for Hire, a group of young Catholic digital content freelancers. You can subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, or on the app Lyceum, and you can also follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod, and we're also over on Facebook at Sacred and Profane Love. If you enjoy this podcast, please tell your friends about us. Please leave us a positive review on iTunes, and also please consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go to www.patreon.com/eudaimoniapod to become a monthly patron. As always, I'd like to thank our most recent patrons for their support, Lawrence Bausch and Ben Constance. Many thanks. For our next episode, I'll be joined by Jessica Hooton-Wilson to talk about Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. Until then, friends, be well and keep reading.